This is Federalist 24, Part 2. Hamilton is answering or rejecting the accusations that the new Constitution is going to establish a big professional army. So the paragraph you're going to start with, 1, 2, 3, 4, it's paragraph 5. Disappointed in his first surmise, the person I have supposed would be apt to pursue his conjectures a little further. He would naturally say to himself, it is impossible that all this vehement and pathetic declamation can be without some colorable pretext. It must needs be that this people, so jealous of their liberties, have, in all the preceding models of the constitutions which they have established, inserted the most precise and rigid precautions on this point, the omission of which in the new plan has given birth to all this apprehension and clamor. So this person he's talking about, if you hadn't seen part 1, he says some imaginary person coming, then if he or she starts reading the newspapers of the time, because of all these anti-federalists' criticism, it would think that we're establishing a big professional army, that we haven't looked at other state constitutions to see how the 13 states are doing. So he's showing the mistakes that all these anti-federalists are making by saying things, writing things in the newspapers that are not true. If under this impression he proceeded to pass in review the several state constitutions, how great would his disappointment to find that 2 only of them contained an interdiction of standing armies in time of peace, that the other 11 had either observed a profound silence on the subject or had in express items admitted the right of the legislature to authorize their existence. Then he himself provides a footnote, and I'll read this footnote for you. The statement of the matter is taken from the printed collections of state constitutions. So he says we're going to look at the state constitutions just to prove our critics wrong and see what the state constitutions say. Pennsylvania and North Carolina are the 2 which contain the interdiction in these words: as standing armies in time of peace are dangerous to liberty, they ought not to be kept up. This is, in truth, rather a caution than prohibition. Okay. Since you're learning English as a second language, let me expand on this, tell you a little bit more. He says only 2 of the 13 states use the word standing armies this way, and he says they interdict the establishment of standing armies in times of peace. In other words, they recommend that this should not be happening. So they use the word ought in the Constitution, in their Constitution, rather than shall not. Because if you notice in Amendment 1 to the U.S. Constitution, they use the word shall not, which gives it an absolute sense, absolute meaning. In other words, you're not going to be able to do this absolutely. Well, here, when they use the word ought not, as Hamilton himself says it, it's a caution rather than prohibition. So it says you shouldn't do it. It's not like you absolutely cannot do it. So keep that in mind when you read this. And then in the footnote, he continues, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Delaware, and Maryland have in each of their Bill of Rights a clause to this effect. Standing armies are dangerous to liberty and ought not to be raised or kept up without the consent of the legislature. So here it says legislature can give consent to raise armies, standing armies, and they again in their constitution use the word ought not. They don't say shall not. So again, it's caution, it's not a prohibition. Then he continues, which is a formal admission of authority of the legislature. So in either case, the legislature has the ultimate authority. They haven't given it to the executive. And legislatures are elected by people. Then he says, New York has no Bill of her rights, and her constitution says not a word about the matter. No Bill of Rights appears annexed to the constitutions of other states, except the foregoing, and their constitutions are equally silent. See, here he's also answering the charges that people are saying in the newspapers that how come you haven't added a Bill of Rights to this Constitution? Which, as we'll see, they'll eventually do that. That's the first thing they do in the first Congress after this Constitution is ratified. So here he's answering all those people. So keep in mind, as I've said before, in these Federalist Papers, they're explaining the Federalist Paper, the Constitution, the concept of federalism, but they're also answering their critics that are constantly writing in newspapers. And the very last part of this footnote, he says, I am told, however, that one or two states have bills of rights which do not appear in this collection, but that those also recognize the right of the legislative authority in this respect. Since we mentioned the Bill of Rights, yes, the Constitution of the United States, for us people living right now, the Constitution itself, if it didn't have the Bill of Rights, if we study the American Constitution now without the Bill of Rights, it won't do anything for us. It's not worth it. It's the Bill of Rights and the following amendments, like I've said, 14, 19, that really, and then some of the amendments that were added after the Civil Rights Movement, these are what makes this Constitution truly, truly meaningful. The Constitution sets up a wonderful framework, but without the Bill of Rights and the other amendments, it really would not amount to much, to be honest with you. So we don't want to talk about giving up our rights just to have a good frame of government. No, the end is the dignity of human beings. So I'm not going to bring this up too many times, but I thought I should just say it here since he was talking about the Bill of Rights. Okay, I'll continue. Still, however, he would be persuaded that there must be some plausible foundation for the cry raised on this head. He would never be able to imagine, while any source of information remained unexplored, that it was nothing more than an experiment upon the public credulity, dictated either by a deliberate intention to deceive or by the overflowings of a zeal too intemperate to be ingenious. It would probably occur to him that he would be likely to find the precautions he was in search of in the primitive compact between the states. Here at length he would expect to meet with a solution of the enigma. No doubt he would observe to himself the existing confederation must contain the most explicit provision against military establishments in time of peace. And a departure from this model in favorite point has occasioned the discontent which appears to influence these political champions. So he says, study the Articles of Confederation, our first constitution. Look and see how incomplete it is when it comes to talking about military, army. We have seen it actually, he says, that during the Revolutionary War, what a mess it was. How we had to make requisitions for money and soldiers, and how badly the state governments under the Articles of Confederation came to help us. Because they did a horrible job. So we're trying to correct it with this Constitution. So we'll continue with this in the next video.